Imagine this. You're a government minister, sitting in your comfortable office, when suddenly a military commander bursts through your door holding a jar. Inside that jar, a human ear, floating in brine, preserved for 8 long years. This isn't the opening of a horror movie. This is how one of the most absurd wars in human history began. Welcome to a journey through the strangest conflicts ever fought, where nations have gone to war over stolen buckets, where elite military forces have been defeated by farm birds, and where a single pig caused a 12-year international standoff. These aren't the wars your history teacher told you about. These are the conflicts so bizarre, so utterly ridiculous, that they sound like comedy sketches, except people actually died in them. Today, we're diving deep into the darkest corners of military history to uncover the truth about humanity's most embarrassing moments of warfare. Picture yourself in a London courtroom in 1738. The room is packed with angry British citizens, all eyes focused on one man, Captain Robert Jenkins. He's about to do something that will change the course of history, and it involves a body part he's been carrying around for nearly a decade. You see, back in 1731, Jenkins was a merchant captain sailing the dangerous waters of the Caribbean when Spanish coast guards boarded his ship. They suspected him of smuggling, and during the violent confrontation that followed, something horrific happened. Captain Julio Leon Fandino, the Spanish officer, didn't just search Jenkins' ship. He took out his cutlass and, in a moment of brutal rage, sliced off Jenkins' left ear. The pain must have been excruciating, blood streaming down his face as he watched his severed ear fall to the deck. But here's where this story goes from tragic to absolutely insane. Most people would have bandaged their wound, cursed their luck, and tried to forget such a traumatic experience. Not Robert Jenkins. This man had a plan. He carefully picked up his severed ear, preserved it in a jar of brine, and carried it with him everywhere he went for the next 8 years. Can you imagine? For 8 years, this man was walking around with his own pickled ear, just waiting for the perfect moment to use it. That moment came when tensions between Britain and Spain were already at a breaking point. Jenkins was called before Parliament, and in the most theatrical political performance of the 18th century, he produced his jar and held up his preserved ear for all to see. The crowd went absolutely wild. This wasn't just testimony. This was physical evidence of Spanish brutality, floating right there in front of them. Jenkins claimed that when the Spanish captain cut off his ear, he had snarled, "Take this to your king and tell him I'll do the same to him if he dares come here." Whether this actually happened or Jenkins embellished the story doesn't matter. The British public was ready for blood. Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who desperately wanted to avoid war, found himself completely overwhelmed by the public outcry. The cry for revenge became deafening, and in October 1739, Britain declared war on Spain. The immediate cause of a 9-year international conflict that would cost thousands of lives and reshape the balance of power in the Americas? One pickled ear in a jar. The war that followed was massive. British forces attacked Spanish colonies across the Caribbean and South America. Admiral Edward Vernon became a national hero by capturing the Spanish fortress of Portobello. The conflict eventually merged with an even larger European war, dragging in most of the major powers of the time. Ships burned, cities were besieged, and thousands of sailors and soldiers died in battles from the Caribbean to the Pacific. All because of that gruesome trophy Jenkins had been carrying around. But here's the truly incredible twist that makes this story even more bizarre. Modern historians aren't even sure Jenkins was telling the truth. Some evidence suggests he might have lost his ear in a completely different incident, possibly as punishment for some earlier crime, and simply blamed the Spanish to get compensation from the government. From pickled ears to stolen buckets, welcome to medieval Italy, where city-states would literally go to war over anything. The year is 1325, and two of Italy's most powerful cities, Bologna and Medina, are about to fight one of the most ridiculous wars in European history. Picture this scene. It's a quiet morning in the small town of Sant'Alessandro, just outside Bologna. Local residents are going about their daily business when suddenly, a group of armed Modenese soldiers appears. They're not here to conquer the town or steal gold. They're here for something much more mundane. They walk straight to the town well, grab the wooden bucket that's used to draw water, and ride off with it like they've just stolen the crown jewels. The bucket wasn't even valuable, just an ordinary oak pail that any carpenter could have made in a few hours. But in medieval Italy, this bucket theft was like a slap in the face. You have to understand the mindset of these Italian city-states. They were incredibly proud, fiercely independent, and obsessed with honor. Bologna wasn't just any city. It was one of the most powerful states in Italy, home to Europe's oldest university, and definitely not the kind of place that would let an insult slide. The bucket theft wasn't really about the bucket. It was about respect. By stealing something so ordinary from right under Bologna's nose, Modena was essentially saying, "We can take whatever we want from you, and there's nothing you can do about it." In a culture where honor meant everything, this was a declaration of war disguised as petty theft. The political situation made it even worse. Bologna supported the Pope's political authority, while Modena backed the Holy Roman Emperor. These weren't just local rivals. They represented completely different visions of how Italy should be ruled. What happened next was absolutely massive. Bologna wasn't going to let this bucket theft slide. They assembled one of the largest armies in medieval Italian history. We're talking about 32,000 infantry soldiers and 2,000 cavalry, a force so huge it could have conquered small kingdoms. The Bolognese were so angry about this bucket that they were willing to risk everything in battle. On November 15, 1325, this enormous army marched on Modena, confident that their overwhelming numbers would crush their bucket-stealing enemies. The Modenese, meanwhile, had allied themselves with other cities and prepared defensive positions on the hills outside their walls. They were outnumbered, but they had better leadership and the advantage of fighting on their home ground. The Battle of Zappolino was an absolute disaster for Bologna. Despite their massive numerical advantage, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Their huge army became a confused, tangled mess as they tried to attack uphill against prepared positions. The Modenese counterattack was devastating. It completely shattered the Bolognese formation and sent thousands of soldiers fleeing in panic. When the dust settled, over 2,000 Bolognese soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, including many of their most important nobles and military leaders. Thousands more were captured, including some of Bologna's key political figures. It was one of the most humiliating military defeats in the city's proud history, all because they couldn't let a bucket theft go unpunished. And what happened to the famous bucket that started this whole bloody mess? The Modenese kept it as the ultimate trophy. They displayed it prominently in their city as a symbol of their incredible victory against impossible odds. That bucket became legendary throughout Italy. Poets wrote about it, musicians sang about it, and storytellers turned it into a symbol of how small provocations can lead to enormous consequences. The great Italian poet Alessandro Tassini even wrote an epic poem called The Stolen Bucket that became one of the most popular works in Italian literature. And here's the amazing part, that bucket still exists today. You can see it in the bell tower of Modena's cathedral, though historians debate whether it's the original or a replacement. Either way, it's probably the only military trophy in the world that you could buy at any hardware store. Now we're jumping forward to 1932 Australia, where the government was about to make one of the most embarrassing military decisions in modern history. Picture this, you're a farmer in Western Australia, and you wake up one morning to find that your entire wheat crop, the crop you've spent months growing, the crop that represents your family's survival during the Great Depression, has been completely destroyed overnight. But this wasn't destroyed by drought or locusts or any normal agricultural disaster. This was destroyed by birds. Not just any birds, emus. Giant, 6-foot-tall, flightless birds that can run faster than a car and apparently have the intelligence of military strategists. These weren't just a few birds causing minor damage. We're talking about flocks of 20,000 emus descending on farmland like feathered armies, stripping entire fields bare in a matter of hours. The scale of this emu invasion was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Farmers across Western Australia were reporting the same nightmare scenario. Massive flocks of these enormous birds appearing seemingly out of nowhere, eating everything in sight, then disappearing before anyone could stop them. And these weren't stupid birds. They were showing tactical intelligence that would have impressed human generals. When farmers set up scarecrows, the emus learned to ignore them. When they tried noisemakers, the birds adapted. When they organized hunting parties, the emus seemed to sense the danger and vanish into the outback. It was like fighting an enemy that could think, plan, and always stay one step ahead. The farmers were desperate, facing complete financial ruin during the worst economic crisis in modern history. So what did the farmers do? They went to the government and made the most bizarre military request in Australian history. They didn't ask for agricultural aid, or pest control experts, or wildlife management specialists. They asked for the army. Specifically, they wanted machine guns and professional soldiers to wage war against the emus. And here's the incredible part: the government said yes. Minister of Defense Sir George Pearce approved a full military operation, complete with soldiers, machine guns, and official military protocols. They assigned Major GPW Meredith, a decorated World War I veteran, to lead this campaign. Can you imagine being a war hero who fought against human enemies in the trenches of France, only to be told your next mission is to fight birds? On November 2, 1932, Major Meredith arrived at the front lines of the Great Emu War, armed with 2 Lewis machine guns, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and 2 soldiers who probably couldn't believe this was their actual military assignment. The plan seemed simple enough. Find the emu flocks, set up the machine guns, and mow them down like enemy infantry. What could possibly go wrong when you're fighting flightless birds with military-grade weapons? Everything as it turned out. The first engagement was a complete embarrassment. They found a flock of about 50 emus, carefully positioned their machine guns for maximum effectiveness, and opened fire. The emus' response? They scattered like they had been trained in evasive maneuvers, using their incredible speed and agility to dodge the gunfire with almost supernatural skill. After the first disastrous encounter, it became clear that the military was dealing with a much more formidable enemy than they had anticipated. These weren't just dumb birds standing around waiting to be shot. They were intelligent, adaptive, and seemed to learn from every encounter. Major Meredith tried everything he could think of. He attempted to herd the emus into killing zones where the machine guns would be more effective, but the birds were too smart and scattered in all directions. He set up ambushes near water sources, but the emus seemed to sense danger and avoided these areas. The most embarrassing incident came when he mounted one of the machine guns on a truck, thinking he could chase down the running emus while firing from the moving vehicle. The rough terrain made accurate shooting impossible, and the truck broke down, leaving the soldiers stranded while emus watched curiously from a safe distance. After 6 days of intensive military operations, the results were humiliating. Major Meredith had fired nearly all 10,000 rounds of ammunition and had killed fewer than 200 emus. The main flocks were completely intact and continuing to destroy crops across the region. The media had a field day with the story. Newspaper headlines mocked the military's inability to defeat flightless birds. Editorial cartoons showed Australian soldiers fleeing from advancing emus. International newspapers treated it as proof of Australian military incompetence. One journalist wrote that the emus had won the war and should be awarded military honors for their tactical superiority. The government, faced with mounting embarrassment, quietly ended the first campaign and hoped everyone would forget about it. But the farmers' problems didn't go away, and later that year they demanded a second military intervention. Reluctantly, the government authorized another emu campaign, hoping to redeem their reputation. The second operation was slightly more successful. They managed to kill about 300 emus over several weeks, but it was still far from the decisive victory the military had promised. The Great Emu War officially ended in December 1932, with the government declaring that military operations against wildlife were not an effective use of resources. Instead, they instituted a bounty system that paid civilians for each dead emu, which actually worked much better than the organized military campaign. The emus had won, and everyone knew it. From Australia's embarrassing defeat by birds, we now travel to Central America for perhaps the most tragic story in our collection. A war that started with soccer but ended with thousands of deaths. The year is 1969, and two small nations, El Salvador and Honduras, are about to demonstrate how quickly sporting rivalry can turn into genuine warfare. It all began with 3 soccer matches that were supposed to determine which country would qualify for the 1970 World Cup. But these weren't ordinary games. They became proxies for much deeper tensions involving immigration, economics, and nationalism that had been building for years. The first match was played in Honduras' capital, and from the moment the Salvadoran team arrived, it was clear this was about much more than soccer. The Honduran fans didn't just want their team to win, they wanted to humiliate El Salvador. The night before the match, thousands of fans surrounded the Salvadoran team's hotel, making sleep impossible with constant noise, fireworks, and intimidation. When Honduras won 1-0, the celebration took on a dark, nationalist edge that went far beyond normal sports enthusiasm. But the real tragedy began when the cameras focused on El Salvador, where 18-year-old Emilia Bolaños was watching the defeat on television. Overcome with despair at her country's loss, she took her father's pistol and shot herself in the heart. Her death became a powerful symbol in El Salvador, where she was proclaimed a patriotic martyr who had died for her country's honor. Her funeral became a massive nationalist rally, with government officials declaring that her sacrifice demanded vengeance. The return match in El Salvador was even more emotionally charged. This time, it was the Honduran team that faced harassment and intimidation, with Salvadoran fans determined to avenge their earlier humiliation. El Salvador won 3-0, but the victory celebration was marred by attacks on Honduran fans and symbols. Both governments were now actively using the soccer matches to whip up nationalist fervor, portraying the games as battles for national honor rather than sporting events. The media in both countries was publishing increasingly inflammatory rhetoric, turning soccer players into warriors and matches into battles. By the time the deciding game was scheduled for Mexico City, the situation had become genuinely dangerous. But here's what makes this story so tragic. The soccer matches were just the spark that ignited much deeper problems. El Salvador was one of the most densely populated countries in the world, with severe land shortages and economic difficulties that the government couldn't solve. Over several decades, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had migrated to Honduras, where land was cheaper and opportunities were better. By 1969, about 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras. That's 20% of Honduras' entire population. Many Hondurans began to resent these immigrants, blaming them for taking jobs and land that should belong to Honduran citizens. The situation was made worse by trade disputes between the two countries, with many Hondurans feeling that El Salvador's more developed economy was exploiting them. When El Salvador won the final soccer match 3-2 in extra time, qualifying for the World Cup, the sporting achievement was completely overshadowed by the crisis that followed. Violence against Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras escalated dramatically. Honduran mobs began attacking Salvadoran neighborhoods, burning homes and businesses, and forcing thousands of people to flee back to El Salvador with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Salvadoran government claimed these attacks were systematic persecution and demanded that Honduras protect Salvadoran citizens. Honduras responded by withdrawing from regional trade agreements and beginning the official expulsion of Salvadoran immigrants. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. What happened next shocked the world. On July 14, 1969, just 2 weeks after the final soccer match, El Salvador